It's July 1944 in the sweltering heat of New Guinea. 4 P-38 Lightning fighters land after a grueling 6.5-hour combat mission deep into enemy territory. 3 highly trained military pilots climb out of their cockpits. Exhausted, their fuel gauges reading nearly empty, with maybe 50 gallons left if they're lucky. But the 4th pilot, a 42-year-old civilian who technically shouldn't even be flying combat missions, climbs out of his aircraft with his gauges showing 210 gallons remaining. Same mission, same aircraft, same weather conditions, same distance flown. But somehow, impossibly, this civilian has used 200 gallons less fuel than America's best fighter pilots. The crew chiefs stare at their fuel measuring sticks in complete disbelief, checking the numbers again and again, because what they're seeing simply shouldn't be possible according to everything they know about aircraft engines. For months, these pilots had been following every procedure exactly by the book, doing precisely what their training manuals and flight instructors had drilled into them since day one of flight school. They'd been explicitly told, warned repeatedly, that deviating from these standard engine settings would cause catastrophic engine failure mid-flight, leaving them to plunge into the Pacific Ocean hundreds of miles from any hope of rescue. But standing on that muddy, rain-soaked airstrip in the South Pacific, watching fuel readings that completely defied everything the Army Air Forces believed about engine management and fuel consumption, one terrifying question hung heavy in the humid tropical air. What if everything they'd been taught about flying these fighters was dangerously, fatally wrong? The man at the center of this aviation mystery was Charles Lindbergh. And yes, we're talking about that Charles Lindbergh, the same pilot who'd become an overnight global celebrity after flying solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, 17 years earlier. But by 1944, Lindbergh's reputation in America had become deeply complicated and controversial, to put it mildly. Before the war erupted, he'd been a prominent and outspoken member of the America First movement, passionately arguing against US involvement in what he saw as another European conflict that didn't concern America. Some critics even accused him of harboring Nazi sympathies after he'd accepted a medal from Hermann Göring during a pre-war visit to Germany and made statements praising German aviation capabilities. When Pearl Harbor was attacked and America entered the war, Lindbergh tried to rejoin the military and return to active duty. But President Franklin Roosevelt personally blocked his commission, essentially blacklisting him from military service. The most famous aviator in American history couldn't get back into uniform no matter how hard he tried. So instead, Lindbergh found a workaround through the private sector. In 1944, he convinced United Aircraft Corporation to hire him as a civilian technical consultant, which gave him a legitimate reason to travel to combat zones in the Pacific Theater, ostensibly to evaluate how their aircraft were performing under actual combat conditions, and to provide technical advice to military units. Now, to understand why Lindbergh's fuel consumption numbers seemed absolutely impossible to the military pilots and ground crews, you need to understand the doctrine that governed how P-38 Lightning fighters were being operated in the Pacific. The P-38 was a unique aircraft, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter with 2 Allison V-1710 engines that gave it impressive speed and firepower, but also made it incredibly fuel-thirsty compared to single-engine fighters. Standard operating procedures, drilled into every P-38 pilot during training and reinforced in every technical manual, called for running the engines at 2200 to 2400 RPM with what's called auto-rich mixture settings. This meant the engines were spinning fast and burning fuel-rich mixtures, consuming over 100 gallons of fuel per hour combined between both engines. At that burn rate, the P-38's published combat radius was 570 miles, which sounds like a lot until you look at a map of the Pacific Theater and realize that most important targets were far beyond that range. Pilots were constantly calculating fuel margins down to the last gallon, figuring out their absolute point of no return. That moment when they had just barely enough fuel to make it back to base if they turned around immediately, every mission became an exercise in fuel anxiety, with young pilots doing complex calculations with slide rules and pencils, knowing that running out of fuel over the Pacific Ocean was Essentially a death sentence, since rescue is extremely unlikely across such vast distances of open water. The reason pilots operated their engines this way wasn't because they were stupid or hadn't thought about fuel efficiency. They were following explicit instructions based on what was called the square rule, or avoiding over-square operation. This was a fundamental principle of aviation engine management that had been taught for decades. The rule stated that you should never run your engine with manifold pressure in inches of mercury, higher than your RPM divided by 100. So if you're running 2400 RPM, you shouldn't exceed 24 inches of manifold pressure. Running over square, meaning high manifold pressure with low RPM, was considered aviation suicide because instructors and technical manuals warned it would cause engine detonation, where the fuel-air mixture explodes uncontrollably instead of burning smoothly, leading to catastrophic engine damage. Bent connecting rods, cracked pistons, and complete engine failure. 4 pilots flying over hundreds of miles of ocean with no place to land except water. Engine failure meant almost certain death, so they followed the rules religiously, without question, because their lives literally depended on engine reliability. When Lindbergh arrived at Hollandia, Air Base in New Guinea, in late June 1944, he wasn't there to make friends or prove a point about his controversial political views. He was there because he'd spent decades thinking about long-range flight efficiency in ways that military pilots simply hadn't. His famous transatlantic flight in 1927 wasn't just about bravery or navigation skill. It was fundamentally an exercise in fuel management, calculating exactly how to make a small single-engine aircraft carry enough fuel to cross the Atlantic, while still being able to take off with that enormous fuel load. Lindbergh had continued working with aircraft manufacturers throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, focusing obsessively on engine efficiency, range optimization, and fuel conservation techniques that most military pilots had never even considered because their training focused on combat and maneuvers, gunnery, and formation flying, not maximum range cruise efficiency. The meeting that would change Pacific air warfare happened almost casually. Colonel Charles McDonald, the 29-year-old commander of the 475th Fighter Group, was playing checkers with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith in their makeshift headquarters when Lindbergh knocked on their door and introduced himself. McDonald, who'd grown up reading about Lindbergh's legendary flight, suddenly found himself face-to-face with aviation royalty, asking to discuss P-38 combat operations. They called in Colonel Warren Lewis, commander of the 433rd Fighter Squadron, and the conversation quickly turned to the crushing reality of their fuel situation. Lewis spread out mission maps showing routes that stretched across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean, explaining how they were flying 6 to 7 hour missions that pushed every limit of the aircraft's capabilities. He described the constant stress of fuel calculations, the pilots who'd been lost to fuel starvation rather than enemy fire, and how the war was moving westward toward targets in the Philippines and beyond. But their fuel capacity wasn't growing with it. Every week, the strategic targets they needed to hit were getting farther away while their fuel tanks stayed exactly the same size. Lindbergh listened quietly, asking specific technical questions about mixture settings, propeller pitch, and cruise altitudes that revealed he understood aircraft power plant management at a level far deeper than most combat pilots ever reached. Then he asked a simple question that would prove revolutionary. Have you experimented with different cruise settings? When Lewis explained, they followed standard procedures with high RPM and rich mixtures because that's what the technical order specified. And what kept the Allison engines running reliably? Something shifted in Lindbergh's expression. It wasn't disagreement exactly, or rather the look of someone who'd heard conventional wisdom that didn't match decades of his own. Personal experience with long-range flying. That's when Lindbergh made his proposal. And it must have sounded absolutely insane to the military officers listening. Reduce your standard 2200 RPM down to 1600 RPM. Set your fuel mixtures to autoline instead of auto-rich. Increase manifold pressure to about 30 inches of mercury to compensate for the lower RPM. You'll save between 50 and 100 gallons per mission. depending on conditions and flight duration. The silence that followed. Lindbergh's suggestion was the kind that happens when someone proposes something that sounds both brilliant and suicidal at the same time. The pilots understood immediately what he was suggesting. He wanted them to run their engines over square. Exactly the configuration they'd been taught would destroy their engines through detonation. He was asking them to reduce RPM by more than 600 revolutions per minute, nearly 30% lower than standard operating procedures, while simultaneously increasing manifold pressure and leaning out the fuel mixture. To the military pilots, this sounded like a recipe for dual-engine failure over enemy territory, which would mean certain death. But Lindbergh had one critical advantage in this argument. He was willing to prove it worked by flying combat missions himself and demonstrating the technique under actual operational conditions where the consequences of being wrong would be fatal. He told McDonald he'd already checked out in the P-38, flying in Major Richard Bong's old aircraft, and he wanted to join their next combat mission to show them his fuel management techniques in action. McDonald faced a command decision with enormous implications. Taking a civilian, even one as famous as Charles Lindbergh, on actual combat operations carried risks that went far beyond normal mission parameters. If Lindbergh was killed flying with his unit, there would be congressional investigations, media scrutiny, and potential career-ending consequences for everyone involved. But something in Lindbergh's quiet confidence, combined with the desperate fuel situation they were facing, convinced McDonald to approve what would become one of the most important test flights in Pacific air warfare. On July 3, 1944, Lindbergh would fly his first combat mission with the 475th Fighter Group, with America's second highest scoring ace, Major Thomas McGuire, flying on his wing specifically to observe his fuel consumption and engine management techniques under combat conditions. The morning of July 3 dawned with clear skies and unlimited visibility. Perfect weather for what was essentially a high-stakes experiment with potentially fatal consequences. If Lindbergh's theories were wrong, the mission profile called for a 1,208 a mile round trip that would push even conventional fuel planning to its absolute limits, with possibilities for air-to-air combat and ground attack opportunities that would require high-power settings that consumed fuel at maximum rates. Before takeoff, Lindbergh set his engines to configurations that must have looked completely wrong to every experienced P-38 pilot watching, 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, and auto-lean mixture settings. His engines ran noticeably quieter than standard settings, with a deeper exhaust note that sounded almost lazy compared to the aggressive high RPM snarl of conventionally configured fighters. As they climbed to cruise altitude and headed northeast toward their patrol area, McDonald maintained his standard settings while watching Lindbergh's aircraft carefully, half expecting to see smoke trails indicating engine problems from the supposedly dangerous over-square operation, but the engine problems never came. As the first hour passed, then the second. Lindbergh's aircraft maintained perfect formation at identical airspeeds and altitudes. Despite its radically different engine configuration, when they encountered Japanese dive bombers and fighters near their target area and engaged in 12 minutes of intense aerial combat with full power settings and aggressive maneuvering, Lindbergh's engines responded normally to combat power demands. With no hesitation, no detonation, no mechanical issues whatsoever, during the brief but violent engagement, Lindbergh maneuvered through the dogfight with a precise control that suggested complete comfort with P-38 handling characteristics. And at one point, when a damaged Japanese Zero turned directly toward him in what appeared to be a ramming attack, Lindbergh's response was immediate and lethal. The brief burst of gunfire sent the Japanese aircraft spiraling toward the ocean, trailing smoke and debris. Lindbergh had scored his first and only aerial victory of the war. But more importantly, he'd proven that fuel efficient cruise techniques didn't compromise combat effectiveness. When applied by pilots who understood both engine management and tactical flying. The real proof came after they landed back at Hollandia, following more than 8 hours of flight time, including extended combat maneuvering at maximum power settings. Ground crews immediately began precise fuel measurements, using calibrated dipsticks to determine exact consumption for each aircraft. McDonald had returned with 18% fuel remaining, which was adequate for mission completion, but offered very little reserve for unexpected circumstances like headwinds or weather diversions. McGuire, who'd been unconsciously experimenting with slightly modified settings after watching Lindbergh throughout the mission, reported similar margins. But when Lindbergh climbed out of his cockpit and the crew chiefs measured his tanks, their instruments showed 34% fuel still remaining. He had enough fuel left for nearly 2 additional hours of flight time. The numbers were undeniable, documented, and witnessed by multiple experienced pilots and mechanics who understood exactly what they were seeing. Using identical aircraft on the same mission, flying the same distance, in the same weather conditions, Lindbergh had consumed approximately 30% less fuel than standard operating procedures. Exactly what he'd predicted during the briefing now. You might think that one successful demonstration would immediately convince everyone to adopt the new technique. But changing institutional doctrine is never that simple, especially when it contradicts fundamental principles that pilots have staked their lives on for years. The skepticism ran deep, rooted in legitimate survival instincts, and reinforced by decades of training that had taught pilots to view over-square operation as fundamentally dangerous. But Lindbergh didn't give up after one mission. He flew multiple combat missions with different squadrons throughout July 1944, consistently demonstrating fuel consumption rates that seemed impossible according to conventional wisdom, while his engines showed absolutely no signs of the damage that was supposed to result from over-square operation. Ground crews, particularly the experienced technical sergeants who'd been working on P-38 engines since before Pearl Harbor, began examining Lindbergh's engines with intense scrutiny after each mission, looking for any evidence of detonation damage, excessive wear, or mechanical stress. What they found was actually the opposite of what everyone expected. Engines operated under Lindbergh's settings showed slightly less wear than comparable aircraft run at standard cruise power, suggesting that lower combustion temperatures, reduced mechanical stress, and improved fuel atomization were actually extending engine life rather than shortening it. The breakthrough moment came on July 28th during a major strike mission 2. WWII. The mission profile was especially demanding, calling for an 8-hour round trip with expected heavy fighter opposition and ground attack operations that would test every aspect of aircraft performance under the most challenging conditions possible. Lindbergh flew on McGuire's wing, positioning himself where the squadron's most experienced and respected combat pilot could observe his techniques during actual aerial combat against veteran Japanese pilots. When they encountered a formation of Japanese aircraft exactly as intelligence had predicted, the engagement that followed was intense and extended. Exactly the kind of fuel-intensive combat that made long-range missions so problematic. The dogfight lasted beyond normal duration, as the Japanese formation leader, later identified as an experienced pilot with hundreds of combat hours, demonstrated the kind of aggressive flying that had made Zero pilots legendary during the early war years. American pilots were forced to respond with maximum power settings, hard maneuvering, and sustained combat that consumed fuel at rates far above cruise consumption. But throughout the engagement, Lindbergh's aircraft maneuvered with the same aggressive tactics as everyone else, his engines responding instantly to power demands with no hesitation. No problems, no limitations despite their supposedly dangerous configuration. When they landed after more than 8 hours airborne, including extended combat, the fuel measurements told a story that finally broke through institutional resistance. McDonald's formation had been calculating emergency landing options and considering water landings if headwinds increased during the return flight, operating on the knife-edge fuel margins that had become grimly routine for Pacific fighter operations. Instead, they landed with adequate reserves, but nothing extra. Lindbergh, meanwhile, touched down with enough fuel remaining for nearly 2 additional hours of flight time. His engines, subjected to detailed post-flight inspections, showed no damage whatsoever, no unusual wear patterns, no mechanical problems that would suggest harmful effects from over-square operation. Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, veteran mechanic who'd been working on Allison V1710 engines for years and understood fuel consumption through daily, meticulous observation of numbers that never lied, finally voiced what the ground crews had been thinking. Colonel McDonald? Either this civilian has magic engines or everything we've been taught about crew settings is wrong. That statement marked the turning point. Within days, pilots throughout the 475th Fighter Group began cautiously experimenting with Lindbergh's techniques on training flights. Discovering that the fuel savings were real, consistent, and repeatable, Lieutenant Bobby Hayes, one of the first to volunteer, returned from his initial attempt visibly shaken by the psychological pressure of running engines in configurations that felt wrong the entire time, like waiting for an explosion that never came. But Hayes also reported fuel consumption that matched Lindbergh's claims almost exactly: 73 gallons per hour total compared to his usual 100-plus gallon burn rate.
Ow.
The fuel gauges didn't care about psychological comfort or institutional doctrine. They simply recorded the mathematical reality of improved efficiency. Within weeks, skepticism transformed into enthusiasm as pilots realized what the new techniques meant for their survival odds and tactical capabilities. Missions that had been impossible under old fuel planning constraints suddenly became routine operations. Targets that had been protected by sheer distance became vulnerable to regular fighter attacks. The combat radius of the P-38 Lightning effectively increased from 570 miles to 750 miles, a 31% improvement. That fundamentally changed what was possible in Pacific air operations. By August 1944, just weeks after Lindbergh's arrival, what had begun as one civilian's controversial suggestion had become standard operating procedure across P-38 units throughout the Pacific Theater. Flight manuals were hastily revised, technical. Orders were rewritten, and instructor pilots found themselves teaching techniques that directly contradicted everything they'd learned during their own training. The institutional revolution happened with startling speed, driven by results that commanders simply couldn't ignore anymore. Mission planning boards and operations tents across the Pacific suddenly showed routes that would have been considered fantasy just months earlier: 950-mile round trips to Bellicopen, extended patrols deep over the Celebes Sea, escort missions that pushed P-38 capabilities to new limits that previous doctrine had considered impossible. The strategic implications were enormous. Japanese installations that had been effectively protected by distance, beyond the range of American fighters, suddenly found themselves under regular attack by formations that could reach them with adequate fuel reserves for sustained combat operations. The human element proved surprisingly adaptable once pilots overcame their initial psychological resistance. Contrary to expectations, the reduced engine noise and vibration from lower RPM settings actually decreased pilot fatigue during extended flights rather than increasing it. Cockpit environments became slightly more comfortable. Oxygen system demands remained manageable, and the crushing psychological pressure of constant fuel calculations diminished to more tolerable levels as pilots gained confidence in the new techniques. Technical Sergeant Kowalski became an unexpected expert on the procedures. Traveling between bases throughout the Pacific to train ground crews on mixture settings and power management that maximized fuel efficiency, his maintenance reports consistently documented engine condition that matched or exceeded standard operational parameters, definitively disproving the decades of warnings about oversquare damage that had been passed down through generations of pilots and mechanics like Aviation. Gospel. What they discovered was that the square rule wasn't actually based on engineering principles or empirical testing, but rather on outdated assumptions and training. Doctrine that had been perpetuated without anyone seriously questioning whether it was actually correct. Major Thomas McGuire emerged as the technique's most effective advocate among combat pilots, as America's second highest scoring ace with 38 confirmed victories. His reputation carried enormous weight throughout the fighter community, and his enthusiastic endorsement of Lindbergh's methods influenced pilots across multiple squadrons and fighter groups. McGuire spent considerable time with Lindbergh during the summer of 1944, flying together, fishing during rare downtime, and discussing the technical principles behind efficient engine management. McGuire understood that what Lindbergh had really done was challenge pilots to think differently about their aircraft. to understand that engines were sophisticated systems that could be optimized for different mission requirements rather than just operated according to one-size-fits-all doctrine. In Mick Geyer's words during a gathering of squadron leaders, the old way of thinking about fuel management was killing us, not through mechanical failure, but through self-imposed limitations that prevented us from reaching targets that should have been within our capability. The statistical evidence became overwhelming as operational reports accumulated throughout late 1944 and into 1945. Pilot survival rates improved measurably as fuel-related emergencies decreased dramatically. Mission success rates increased because formations could remain over target areas for extended periods without anxiety about having enough fuel to return home. Enemy installations that had been protected by geography became vulnerable to sustained air campaigns. Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific theater suddenly found themselves facing American fighter attacks at ranges they'd calculated were impossible, forcing them to divert resources to defend installations they'd thought were safely beyond enemy fighter range. The tactical balance shifted as American fighters gained operational capabilities that matched the vast distances of oceanic warfare. Fighter pilots who'd been struggling with 6-hour missions were now routinely flying 9-hour sorties with adequate reserves, fundamentally changing the strategic possibilities for air campaign planning. By the time Lindbergh departed the Pacific Theater in August 1944, he'd flown approximately 50 combat missions and personally demonstrated his fuel efficiency techniques to dozens of squadrons across multiple fighter groups. He left behind a revolution in how America's most important twin-engine fighter operated in the war's largest theater of operations. The institutional lesson extended far beyond simple fuel conservation into profound questions about military doctrine and innovation. The P-38 fuel efficiency breakthrough had demonstrated that conventional wisdom, even when supported by extensive training programs, official technical documentation, and decades of accepted practice, could be fundamentally incorrect about basic operational principles. The speed with which new techniques replaced established procedures once undeniable evidence was presented suggested that military organizations could adapt rapidly when confronted with results that couldn't be dismissed or explained away through appeals to authority or tradition. The final mission statistics told the story with brutal mathematical precision. Combat radius extended by 31%. Fuel consumption reduced by 30%. Mission duration capability increased by 40%. These weren't theoretical improvements or marginal gains. These were revolutionary changes that influenced air campaign planning throughout the remaining months of the Pacific War, and established precedents for long-range fighter operations that would continue through the Korean War, Vietnam, and beyond. Training squadrons back in the United States incorporated the new cruise procedures into standard instruction curricula by late 1944, meaning newly graduated pilots arrived in combat units already familiar with techniques that their predecessors had learned through dangerous trial and error over hostile territory. The institutional learning curve that had cost lives was compressed into systematic training that saved them. What makes this story truly remarkable isn't just the technical achievement of discovering more efficient engine settings, though that alone was significant. What's extraordinary is how one civilian, operating outside the military chain of command, challenged fundamental aviation doctrine that had been accepted without serious question for decades, proved his theories correct under combat conditions, where being wrong meant death, and convinced an entire military organization to abandon. Established procedures in favor of techniques that had seemed impossible, according to everything they thought they knew. Lindbergh's contribution to the Pacific Air War didn't come from flying more combat missions than anyone else or shooting down more enemy aircraft. Though he did earn one confirmed aerial victory, his impact came from applying decades of long-range flying experience to a specific operational problem, refusing to accept that current limitations were actually limits rather than just current practices, and demonstrating through personal example that better solutions existed if people were willing to question conventional wisdom. The quiet revolution that began with a simple conversation about engine settings in a sweltering tent at Hollandia Air Base fundamentally changed how America fought the air war across the Pacific. Thousands of pilots who never met Charles Lindbergh flew longer, farther, and more effectively because one controversial civilian challenged their assumptions and proved that the impossible. Fuel savings were not only possible but routine once you understood the actual engineering principles rather than relying on outdated training doctrine. The lesson was both elegantly simple and profoundly important. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the rules need to be broken. And sometimes saving fuel really does mean winning battles. In the vast distances of Pacific warfare, where fuel was survival and range was victory, Lindbergh's contribution was measured not in gallons saved, but in lives preserved, missions accomplished, and strategic capabilities that transformed what American air power could achieve across an ocean that had once seemed too vast to fully control from the air.